Hi, everyone. This is D Knight back at you for the second half of my chapter on Nicaragua from my memoir, My Whirlwind Lives Navigating Decades of Storms. Uh, I'll read read the last paragraph that I read before. In Central America, Reagan used proxies to fight his counter-revolution. Military fascists who trained at the School of the Americas in Georgia used death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala to slaughter tens of thousands of peasants, as well as a number of North American Catholic nuns and the Archbishop of San Salvador. In Nicaragua, the U.S. supported Contras, dubbed freedom fighters by Reagan, spread terror in the countryside, trying to reverse the Sandinista gains. In 1979, the same year the Sandinistas triumphed, a revolution broke out in Iran, ending the 26-year dictatorship of Shah Reza Pahlavi. The Shah had been enthroned in 1953 during a CIA-engineered coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had committed the unforgivable sin of moving to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Shortly after the 1979 revolution triumphed, young Iranians stormed the U.S. Embassy and took 52 hostages. They held the embassy for more than a year and brought defeat and disgrace to President Jimmy Carter. Successor Ronald Reagan hit back hard by fomenting a war between Iran and neighboring Iraq. This conflict dragged on for 8 years, resulting in nearly 1 million deaths and casualties on both sides. The U.S. backed Iraq against Iran, but allowed the war to end in stalemate in 1988. Henry Kissinger famously observed, "It's a pity both sides can't lose." At the time, Kissinger also quipped, "The illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional takes a little longer." Ever since then, the U.S. has waged either covert or open war against both Iraq and Iran. George H.W. Bush, Sr., launched the Desert Storm invasion against Iraq almost immediately after his inauguration in 1991. Officially, the war aimed at toppling Saddam Hussein, but in reality, it facilitated U.S. takeover of Iraqi oil. This sudden shock and awe invasion morphed into 12 years of brutal sanctions, really a war of attrition. George W. Bush Jr.'s misdirected retaliation for 9/11, launched in late 2003, was a disastrous and criminal failure and has dragged on and on. Regardless of claims of weapons of mass destruction, etc., it was mainly about profits for U.S. oil companies and military contractors, but has caused endless tragedies for ordinary Americans and Iraqis. About Face Veterans Against the War has mobilized often against the war makers, exposing the lies and telling the truth. I was also involved in very large-scale mobilizations against these invasions at that time. Returning to the topic of Nicaragua in the 1980s, Reagan's people cleverly managed money designated for counter-revolution in Iran to fund the Nicaraguan Contras in an illegal operation that became known as Iran-Contragate. The Gate part harkened back to the Watergate scandal that ended Nixon's presidency in 1974. This time, despite loud protests against obvious violations of U.S. and international law, Reagan survived as the Teflon president. He managed to keep the Contras going long enough to strangle Nicaragua's economy and to set the stage for the Sandinistas' electoral defeat in 1990. Reduced backing from the USSR also constituted a major factor. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, caused by unrelenting pressure to maintain the balance of terror with the USA, left revolutionary countries like Nicaragua and Cuba without the bastion of support they needed. It also showed the importance of the USSR to the world revolutionary movement and the enormous cost of its loss. Close friends and comrades of mine were deeply demoralized by this loss. In at least one case, a comrade resigned from revolutionary activity in tears. Decades later, Sandinista President Daniel Ortega has had to fight back against an aggressive campaign to discredit his government as illegitimate and dictatorial. Nicaragua has had the highest growth rate in Central America in recent years. Annual minimum wage increases at 5 to 7% above inflation, improving workers' living conditions and lifting people out of poverty. The poverty rate fell by 30% between 2005 and 2014. The Task Force on Central America reports that for more than a decade, Nicaragua has been the safest country in Latin America. Its police force is internationally recognized for innovative community policing policies. Unlike neighboring El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, where terrorized families have been fleeing to the U.S. border, Nicaragua has minimal gang violence or organized drug cartels. In contrast with Honduras, things are especially interesting. In 2010, the U.S. engineered and sponsored a coup d'etat against the popular Honduran president Mel Zelaya after he aligned his government with Venezuela and Nicaragua. Since then, tens of thousands of Hondurans have fled in panic from death squads and gangs. Nicaragua has free health care for all, free education from preschool through college and graduate school, 1 month's paid vacation, 13 paid holidays, and an extra month's pay each year. In 2021, during the run-up to Nicaragua's November elections, corporate media screamed after the Sandinista government arrested several opposition figures for alleged money laundering. The money in question comes from the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. More than $160 million, according to the USAID website. This aid has gone to opposition parties and media and non-governmental organizations. It helped finance a failed coup attempt in 2018 and is meant to strengthen the opposition in the 2021 elections, an exact copy of the strategy used in 1990 to engineer the Sandinista electoral defeat. This time, the Nicaraguan government established strict accounting laws to force the sums into the open. For comparison, since the U.S. economy is 1,750 times bigger than Nicaragua's, a similar effort in the U.S. would involve about $280 billion. My friend Jerry Condon of Veterans for Peace wrote in July 2021 for the LA Progressive, "Why do the media hate Daniel Ortega?" He said recent polls show the Ortega government retaining widespread support and easily defeating even a united opposition ticket. They have nothing to fear at the ballot box. After explaining the money laundering issue, he tells of the 2018 attempted coup in Nicaragua, widespread coordinated violence apparently taking the Ortega government by surprise. Barricades blocked many roads, bringing commerce to a halt. A sophisticated social media campaign brought people into the streets with lies about the police killing students. Government buildings were torched. Over 200 people died in street violence over several weeks. Half or more of the dead were Sandinistas, including 24 police. Videos were posted online of Sandinistas being tortured and even burned alive at the barricades. Daniel Ortega deflated the attempted coup by showing great restraint, Jerry writes. Ortega pulled the police back to their barracks. He kept the army out of the fray. He negotiated with opposition leaders, and he granted amnesty to those who had joined in these violent events. Ortega is now praised for having the wisdom not to overreact, not to cause further violence and chaos. Nonetheless, Western media prefers to paint Ortega as an authoritarian dictator who violently represses dissent and jails his political adversaries. It was a classic CIA color revolution that failed, but USAID and NED haven't stopped, and the U.S. Congress has imposed brutal sanctions that punish the Nicaraguan people for supporting their Sandinista government. Jerry's version of events is backed up by John Perry of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, who wrote from Masaya, where he lived during the attempted coup, that my day-to-day conversations tell me support for government policies remains strong. that hardly anyone wants a return to the roadblocks and violence deployed by government opponents in 2018, and that economic recovery after the damage done then and by the pandemic and hurricanes in 2020 are much bigger priorities than any concerns about recent government action against its opponents. Other reports debunked the corporate media's version. Two major articles by Peter Bolton in Counterpunch and another by Ben Norton in the Gray Zone. Carlos Fonseca Terán, the son of the original founder of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, wrote passionately on July 19, 2021, the 42nd anniversary of Nicaragua's revolution. Nicaragua is in the news again, but not for being one of the countries with the greatest reduction in poverty and social inequality, nor for being the country with the highest level of direct ownership of the means of production by the working class in the Western Hemisphere, more than 50% of GDP and nearly 80% of economic units, nor for being one of the countries in the world that has most reduced illiteracy and with the largest reduction in infant mortality. Nicaragua is not in the news for being the country in the world that has most reduced the gender gap from 90th to 12th, the country with the highest presence of women in its cabinet, 58.82%, as well as having the fourth highest presence of women in the legislative branch, 48.4%, and being the country that most radically applies the criterion of gender equity across its social policies. Nor is this country in the news for being among the countries that have most increased electricity coverage from 53% to 99%, and the one that has most increased its renewable energy sources from 2% to 90%, nor for being the safest country in Central America and one of the safest in Latin America. Nor is Nicaragua news for having one of the governments in the world with the highest sustained popular support for the longest period of time, with rates around 60% in the last 11 years. In other words, for Fonseca Terán, the Sandinista government is popular rebellion in power, fighting from the government against the age-old system imposed by the oppressor classes. The U.S. government, the U.S. corporate media don't like that. I do. That's it for this reading. I hope you like it, and I hope that you'll order the book, where you'll get a little bit more of this chapter and a whole lot more on my experience both in Nicaragua as well as in Canada, in Europe and Africa, and right here at home. I look forward to seeing you again. Please feel free to go to my blog, dknight.blog, for more. Thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye for now.